They put me at table 19. I know this because I counted the tables between mine and the head table while the string quartet was playing something from Vivaldi that no one was listening to, and the number was 19. My table was in the far left corner of the reception hall of the Chateau de Montsoreau, a 16th century Loire Valley property that the Fontaine family had rented for 420,000 euros for a single evening. I know the figure because my son told me with the specific pride of someone who has been told to be proud of something and has complied. I know the table was designed as an afterthought because the linen was a slightly different shade of white from the surrounding tables of cream that had been laundered one too many times, and because the centerpiece was the smallest in the room. A single arrangement of white lilies in a plain glass vase, while every other table had towering constructions of orchids and eucalyptus that the florist from Paris had been paid 17,000 euros to design. I sat at the small lily table in my good suit, which was not a very good suit by the standards of this room, and I drank my water and I watched my son. His name is Mathieu. He is 34 years old and he is the best architect working in France today. And I say this not as a father making an inflated claim, but as a man who has spent 40 years commissioning buildings and who knows the difference between someone who designs structures and someone who understands them. He was sitting at the head table between his bride and his best man, wearing a morning suit that the Fontaine family had apparently suggested gently but insistently that he purchase from a specific tailor on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré in Paris. He looked like himself in someone else's clothes, which is to say he looked slightly uncomfortable and entirely decent. He was smiling at the room with the slightly fixed quality of a man managing a great deal of information simultaneously. I recognized that smile. It was the smile he had worn as a boy when he was trying to be polite to someone he did not like. The bride was Camille Fontaine. She was 29, the only daughter of Gérard and Hélène Fontaine of Lyon. And she was by any objective measure a beautiful young woman in an extraordinary dress. The dress had been made in Paris and had cost, according to the figure that drifted to me through the family grapevine, 38,000 euros. It was worth every centime in the narrow accounting of pure construction, the kind of accounting I understood from a lifetime of looking at things built well versus things built to appear built well. It was white silk structured precisely to the body with hand-embroidered detail at the bodice that had taken 6 weeks of a seamstress's skilled labor. Camille wore it the way certain people wear beautiful things, as if the thing existed to confirm something about them rather than to be beautiful in itself. She held her champagne glass and laughed at things her mother said and looked at the photographer, and I watched all of this from my small lily table at the far left of the room, and I thought about things. I am going to tell you who I am before I tell you what happened at the wedding, because the story does not work without that foundation. And I have always been a man who understands that foundations are the part of the structure no one can see, and that they are therefore exactly the part that matters most. My name is Bernard Auger. I am 68 years old and I was born in a 2-room apartment above a hardware shop in the 20th arrondissement of Paris, the second son of a man who drove a delivery lorry for a wholesale grocery distributor and a woman who worked the early shift at a bakery on the Avenue Gambetta 3 mornings a week and looked after us the rest of the time. I grew up understanding that money was a thing that other people had and that the relationship between our family and money was one of careful management and frequent shortage. I do not say this to make a claim on your sympathy. I say it because it is the factual context from which everything else follows. I left school at 16 and went to work in the construction industry as a general laborer on a residential site in the eastern suburbs of Paris. I was large for my age, stronger than I looked, and I had a quality that I did not know the name of then, but that I have come to understand over the decades as the capacity to see the structure of a thing. I could watch 2 bricklayers and tell you within 20 minutes which one understood the wall and which one was simply laying bricks. I could look at a foundation plan and find the point at which the load distribution was incorrect. I did not know the engineering vocabulary at 16. I simply knew what I could see. I worked construction sites for 11 years, and those 11 years require more than a sentence because they were the years in which everything useful about me was formed. I worked in rain and heat and the specific cold of French winters that is not the dramatic cold of mountains, but the gray, persistent cold of northern plains that gets into the bones of whatever you are building and requires constant vigilance against frost damage. I worked with men who had been on sites for 30 years and who knew things about materials and forces that were not in any textbook, and who would share that knowledge with you if you demonstrated that you were worth sharing it with. I learned to demonstrate this by watching first and speaking after, by asking questions that showed I had already thought about the answer before asking, and by never pretending to know something I did not know. These were not strategies I had been taught. They were things I discovered worked through trial and observation the way all genuinely useful knowledge is discovered. I also learned to read people during those years. A construction site is a compressed social environment in which the relationships between authority and competence and character are made visible by the physical demands of the work. You cannot pretend on a site for long. The work shows you who people are, who holds their nerve under pressure, who cuts corners when no one is watching. No. Who covers for a colleague's error and who deflects it, who drinks the previous night and who is fully present at 7 in the morning, who argues the job and who argues the credit. I became very good at reading these things and I have never stopped reading them. I worked my way from laborer to site foreman to project coordinator through the specific mechanism of being consistently right about things and consistently present on the days when other people were not. At 27, I was coordinating a commercial construction project in the Marais for a property development company whose owner, a man named Claude Reinhardt, had the habit of arriving on site unannounced at unexpected hours to check on things. He found me on site at 6:30 in the morning of a day when work was not scheduled, measuring a load-bearing wall that I had calculated overnight was going to cause a problem in 6 months if the design was not modified. He stood beside me and looked at my calculations on the back of a materials receipt and did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "Do you know what you are looking at?" I told him what I was looking at. He stood there for another 5 minutes, and then he said, "How would you fix it?" I told him that too. He made me a junior project director at 27 and a full project director at 29. At 31, I left his firm with his blessing, a handshake, and a referral to 3 of his most important clients. I started Auger Development in 1987 with 1 project, 1 employee, and an overdraft facility from a small regional bank whose manager I had repaired a drainage problem for. On my own time because he mentioned it in passing and I knew how to fix it and I fixed it without being asked. That is how I conducted myself. I fixed things that were in front of me without calculating whether the fixing would be rewarded. The rewards generally came. They did not come from the fixing itself, but from the quality of person you became by fixing things regardless of reward. Auger Development grew. I will not take you through every project and every year because the story of a construction company's growth is a story about decisions compounding over time and it is not inherently dramatic. But I will tell you that the first decade was the decade of establishing credibility, which in the construction industry means delivering what you promise on time and within the figure you quoted and with the quality that the drawing specified. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires the management of supply chains and subcontractors and weather and municipal bureaucracy and client changes of mind and material shortages and labor disputes and the specific unpredictability of what you find when you open the ground under an old building in a French city. I managed all of these things because I had spent 11 years learning how they worked from the inside. And I made decisions quickly and correctly because quick and correct decisions on a construction site are the difference between a project that delivers and a project that destroys the company. By the second decade, the company had a reputation, and the reputation attracted larger projects, and the larger projects attracted better people, and the better people made possible even larger projects. I hired engineers and architects and project managers who were better at their specific functions than I would ever be, and I gave them the authority to exercise their expertise while maintaining the structural oversight of the whole. This is the most important management principle. I know hire people who are better than you at specific things and give them room to be better. But understand the structure well enough to know when something is going wrong before they tell you. Most managers do one of these two things. I tried to do both. By the time Matthew was born in 1990, we had 42 employees and a project portfolio of 380 million euros. By the time he was 10, we had 1,000 employees, and I had transferred the majority of my personal wealth into a holding structure that my accountant, a meticulous Swiss man named Paul Krieger, had designed to be as invisible as a good foundation is invisible. Not to evade anything, to maintain the specific privacy that I had come to understand was both practically useful and personally important. I did not want my identity as a wealthy man to precede me into rooms. I wanted to enter rooms as Bernard Auger and be judged on what Bernard Auger did and said and knew. Matthew grew up knowing we were comfortable and not knowing the full dimensions of what comfortable meant. This was deliberate. He went to good schools, but not the schools that announced their quality through their price. He grew up in our house in the 15th arrondissement, a good solid house on a good solid street with a garden that I tended myself on Saturday mornings and neighbors who were teachers and civil servants and small business owners. He did his homework at the kitchen table. He took the metro. He understood that things cost money and that money came from work and that work required showing up and performing correctly and that there were no shortcuts in any of this. He became an architect because he loved buildings the way I love buildings, for the structural logic of them, for the way they organized space and light and the movement of people through a day. He was good at it, then excellent at it. Then the kind of person other architects talked about in the specific tone of genuine admiration rather than competitive assessment. He met Camille Fontaine at a client presentation in Lyon where he was pitching a mixed-use cultural development project, and she was attending as the representative of her father's investment portfolio. She was intelligent and she was beautiful and she was attentive in the way of someone who has been educated to appear attentive, which is technically the same behavior as being attentive, but feels to a person paying close attention subtly different. I noticed the difference when Matthew brought her to Paris for the first time. She asked me good questions about my work, but her eyes moved to the room while I was answering them, assessing the furniture, the art on the walls, the quality of the things around her, calibrating her estimate of what the house represented. I noticed this and I said nothing to Matthew because he was 32 and in love, and I had learned that a man of 32 in love requires evidence, not opinion. The evidence accumulated slowly. The way Camille spoke about her family had a specific quality, a constant reference to the Fontaines as a unit of established standing, as if the family name was a credential that needed to be cited regularly to maintain its validity. The way she discussed Matthew's work was warm but slightly proprietary. As if his talent was an asset she had identified and secured rather than a quality she admired independently of what it could provide. The way she looked at the things in our house when Matthew was out of the room, she had very quick eyes. She was always calculating. I have no objection to calculation as a human trait. I am a calculator myself. But calculation about people is different from calculation about buildings because people are not assets, and the calculation that treats them as assets eventually encounters the moment when the asset fails to perform as expected, and the calculator has no framework for that failure. The Fontaines. Gerard Fontaine was 62 years old, a man from a Lyon textile family that had been prosperous for 2 generations and had spent most of those 2 generations ensuring that everyone in their social vicinity was aware of the prosperity. He was tall and thin, with the particular posture of a man who has spent decades being deferred to and has internalized that deference as a statement about his natural elevation. He dressed with the deliberate quality of someone who had studied how wealthy men dressed and had replicated the study correctly without having any inherent interest in clothes. He had a firm in Lyon that managed the family's historic textile assets and a series of newer investments that had not performed consistently, but that he described with the confidence of someone for whom performance is a secondary consideration to presentation. I met Gerard Fontaine for the first time at a dinner in Lyon that Mathieu had organized at a restaurant he liked in the Presqu'Île district. There were six of us, Mathieu and Camille Girard and Hélène and me and Paul Krieger, whom I had invited because Paul's presence serves a useful function at social occasions where I need a second set of observations. Paul is the least remarkable looking man I know. He is 61, medium height, medium build, the kind of face that people remember as generic rather than specific. He has been watching the specific behaviors of people in relation to money for 35 years, and he can read them with a precision I find invaluable. We met at the restaurant at 8 in the evening. Gerard Fontaine arrived first, which I noted because arriving before the guest you are assessing is a choice that communicates something about how you see the evening. He was standing at the bar when Mathieu and Camille arrived, and he shook Mathieu's hand with the specific shake of a man establishing rather than greeting, and the hand extended a fraction too soon, the grip slightly too firm, the eye contact slightly too direct. He shook my hand next, and I felt his assessment of it, the calluses, the weight, the history in it, and I watched his face for the fraction of a second in which he processed this and filed it. He shook Paul's hand without particular interest, which was correct because Paul gave him nothing to be interested in. Over dinner, Girard spoke about his family and his firm and his social connections in Lyon with the fluency of someone for whom these subjects are the primary vocabulary of self. He asked me about my work, and when I said I was in construction and development, he asked no follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity, only the procedural questions of a man establishing a category. What kind of projects? Mostly commercial and residential. What scale? Medium to large. Where based? Paris primarily, but national. He nodded and moved to another subject. He had filed me under trades reasonable scale regional, not significant. He had done this in approximately 90 seconds, and he was wrong about every element of the filing. Hélène talked to me about Paris, about neighborhoods, about the differences between Paris and Lyon, about whether I found the TGV journey convenient. She was gracious in the specific way of women who have been trained to include peripheral guests in the conversation without actually engaging them as full participants. The questions she asked me were questions that kept me talking without requiring her to be interested in the answers. I answered them pleasantly. Paul ate his duck and watched Gerard. After the dinner, Paul walked with me to my hotel and he said, "The father is managing something financially." There was a moment when you mentioned the Paris office and his hand tightened on his glass. He has heard of Auger Développement, and he is calculating whether the man across from him is that Auger. He is deciding he is not because the suit and the manner do not correspond, he said. He will continue to decide this because it is the more comfortable conclusion. I said, "Yes, I know." I said, "What do you think of the daughter?" Paul thought about it. He said, "She is her father's student." I said, "That is what I thought." His wife Hélène was 60 from Bordeaux originally and had the specific social competence of a woman who had spent her entire adult life in a milieu where competence was measured by the management of appearances. She was gracious at distances of more than 10 feet and precise and controlled at closer range. When she shook my hand at our first meeting, she looked at my hand specifically before taking it a fraction of a second, but I saw it. She was reading the hand, the calluses, the evidence of physical work. She read it and she filed it. And from that moment, I was categorized. I was filed under acceptable but not relevant. Not a threat to the match because the match was already concluded in terms of practical value. Mathieu was talented and employed and upwardly mobile and had been invited to present at the European Architecture Forum 3 times before the age of 34. The Fontaines had decided he was acceptable. What his father was or was not was a peripheral matter. They would manage the peripheral matter through the specific mechanism that well-practiced social families use to manage inconvenient peripherals. They would place me at a small table with small flowers and be very gracious to my face when necessary, and speak about me in other terms when that was more convenient. I knew all of this before the wedding. I knew it the way, a foundation problem before it manifests, from the structural evidence, from the small signs that accumulate into a clear diagnosis. I came to the wedding prepared. The preparation had begun 6 months earlier when Mathieu had called me from Lyon to tell me that the Fontaines had expressed some concerns about the wedding dynamics. He said this carefully in the specific tone of someone who has been asked to relay a message that he does not entirely endorse. The concerns as he transmitted them were that my presence at the wedding would be significant and that the Fontaines hoped I would understand the nature of the occasion and present myself appropriately, and that Camille's family had a certain reputation to maintain, and that my background was, and here Mathieu paused, and I could hear him searching for a word that was not the word Gerard Fontaine had used, different from the Fontaine background, and that some sensitivity on my part would be appreciated. I listened to all of this, then I said, Mathieu, what did they actually say? Another pause. He said, Gerard suggested that perhaps you might be more comfortable at a smaller table away from the family section. He said the head table seating had already been arranged. He said he hoped I would understand. I said I understand perfectly. Tell them I will be there and I will behave appropriately. There will be no difficulty from my side. Mathieu said, Papa. He said it in the tone he used when he was worried about me and did not know how to frame the worry. I said, Mathieu, I love you. I will see you at the wedding. He said, I love you too. I said, I know. That is all that matters. After I ended the call, I sat in my office on the 7th floor of the building I owned outright in the 8th arrondissement, and I looked out at the Seine for a while. The river was doing what it always did, moving in its particular direction without consulting anyone about the direction it was moving in. I found this comforting. Then I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Paul Krieger. I told him what Mathieu had relayed, and I told him I wanted a complete picture of Gerard Fontaine's financial structure, specifically the financing arrangements behind his 4 active development projects, and specifically any intersection those arrangements might have with entities in my portfolio. Paul said he would have the picture within 10 days. He had it in 7. The picture was what I had suspected from the Lyon dinner. Gerard's business had been expanding beyond its natural structural capacity through aggressive use of co-financing from a consortium that included as one of its less prominent members a vehicle called Société Foncière du Rhône, which was a subsidiary of a company called Vallon Investissements, which was wholly owned by Ceylon Capital, which was mine. The total co-financing exposure was 47 million euros across 4 projects. I had not known this specifically before Paul's research, which I want to be clear about, because the coincidence might otherwise seem implausible. I had known in a general sense that Ceylon Capital's co-financing vehicles had interests across the Lyon commercial property sector because I had reviewed the annual portfolio reports and seen Lyon exposure. I had not connected that exposure to Gerard Fontaine's projects specifically because Gerard Fontaine was not a name I had needed to connect to anything before Mathieu introduced him as a potential father-in-law. The connection was real, it was documented, and it was entirely legal. It was also, as I looked at it across Paul's desk on a Wednesday morning in February, a structural fact of the highest relevance. The second call was to Isabelle Marchetti. I told her I wanted to understand the contractual terms under which Ceylon Capital could exercise withdrawal rights from the 4 Fontaine co-financing arrangements. She reviewed the agreements and called back the following morning. She said the withdrawal terms were standard and clean 30 days written notice, no penalty provisions, no requirement to specify grounds. She said, do you want me to prepare the notice? I said, not yet. Prepare it and hold it. She said, understood. The third call was to a man named Henri Laroche. Henri is 64 years old, and he is the editor-in-chief of a business and financial journal called Capital and Structures that is read by approximately 40,000 people, and that is considered the reference publication for French commercial property and construction finance. I have known Henri for 20 years, and he has interviewed me 3 times, and we have had over those 20 years a relationship of mutual professional respect based on the understanding that I do not make myself available to him for casual comment, and that when I do make myself available, there is something worth publishing. I told Henri that approximately 3 months from now, there might be an interesting story about co-financing structures in the Lyon commercial property sector. I told him nothing more specific than that. He said, "When you say interesting," I said consequential. He said, "I will be ready." I said, "Good." I made these 3 calls and then I waited. I was good at waiting. Waiting is the most underrated professional skill I know. Anyone can act. The capacity to wait until the correct moment to act without becoming anxious or premature is what separates people who get what they want from people who get what they can see. The wedding was on a Saturday in June. I drove to the Loire Valley in my own car, which is a 7-year-old dark blue Peugeot 508 that I bought because it drives well and uses diesel efficiently and has a large boot for carrying things, which is what a car is for. I arrived at the Chateau de Montsoreau at 11 in the morning, 2 hours before the ceremony because I am always early. I parked in the visitor car park among the catering vans and the florist's truck, and I walked into the chateau and gave my name to the young woman at the welcome table and received my table card. Table 19. I nodded and put it in my breast pocket and went to find my seat. The ceremony took place in the chapel adjacent to the main building. Matthew stood at the altar looking the way men look at altars, slightly suspended between what they know and what they are committing to, and I sat in the 4th row on the left side and watched my son and thought about his mother, who had died when Matthew was 9 of a respiratory illness that had developed rapidly and that I had not understood was serious until it was too serious to manage. Her name was Christine, and she had been a primary school teacher, and she had had a quality of absolute genuine attention that I have looked for in other people ever since and have found only rarely. Matthew had her attention. Matthew. He had her quality of being fully present for the person in front of him. It was the thing about him I was most proud of, and it was also on the evidence of the woman he was marrying, the thing that was most likely to be used against him. The ceremony was performed by a priest from the local parish and took 45 minutes, and Camille cried at the vows in a way that could have been genuine and could have been managed, and I could not tell which with certainty, and gave it the benefit I would want given to me. Then we processed to the reception hall, and I found table 19 and sat down, and a waiter brought water and a bread roll, and I ate the bread roll and waited. The speeches began after the 3rd course. Gerard Fontaine spoke first. He was a practiced public speaker in the way of men who have given many speeches at events where the primary audience was people they wanted to impress, which is to say, technically accomplished, but fundamentally hollow, all surface tension and no structural integrity. He spoke about the Fontaine family's history and values, about Camille's upbringing and education, about the Lyon Cultural Foundation that Hélène chaired, about the satisfaction of seeing their daughter married to a man of talent. He did not mention me. He mentioned Matthew's professional achievements twice and his origins once in the specific phrasing of someone who is technically acknowledging something while ensuring it sounds like a compliment. Matthew has come very far, he said, and the Fontaines are proud to welcome him into a family that will give him the context he deserves. Give him the context he deserves. I wrote that phrase down on the back of the table card in case I forgot it. I did not forget it. Then Hélène spoke. She was shorter and more pointed than her husband, with the precision of a woman who had spent decades making social assessments and had learned to package them as warmth. She talked about Camille's happiness and about the kind of home she hoped they would build together, and about the importance of a strong family network for a young couple. And she looked at me exactly once during the speech, a brief, deliberate look that was an acknowledgement of my presence and a reminder of its category simultaneously. I nodded pleasantly. She looked away. Then the best man spoke, a friend of Matthew's from architecture school named Sebastian, who was funny in the genuine way, and who told 3 stories about Mathieu that were embarrassing in the generous way stories at weddings should be, and I laughed with the room and felt for a few minutes like myself. Then Gerard stood up again. I had not expected a second speech. The room had settled into the post-speech champagne comfort of people who believe the formal business is concluded. Gerard tapped his glass. The room came back to attention. He smiled the smile that had too many teeth as I thought of it by then. He said he had forgotten to mention something. He said it with the ease of a man who had not forgotten anything for whom this moment was entirely planned. He began to walk from the head table. The room watched him. He walked with the spotlight of complete social confidence, moving between the tables, acknowledging people he knew with small nods and gestures, performing the ease of a man at home in his domain. He walked past table 4, table 7, table 11. He walked to the back of the room. He walked to table 19. He stopped at my table. He looked down at me. 500 people turned in their chairs. 500 pairs of eyes found table 19, found the small lily centerpiece, found the man in the not very good suit who had been placed there for exactly this moment. I sat completely still. I have sat still in more difficult situations than a Loire Valley reception hall. I looked back at Gerard with the specific quality of attention I give to things I am assessing, which is to say completely and without visible reaction. He spoke to the room, but he was looking at me. He said that family was a complicated thing and that when 2 families joined through marriage, there were sometimes significant differences in background and circumstance that had to be acknowledged honestly. He said the Fontaine family believed in honesty. He said he wanted to acknowledge the man sitting at table 19 who was the father of the groom and who had, he said, worked very hard in his own way in the trades, he said in the laboring professions, and that this was admirable in its own fashion, he said, and that Mathieu's success was a credit to the determination of a young man who had risen above his circumstances. He paused. He looked around the room. He said, "We have all seen the photographs, haven't we?" And smiled. And there was laughter from the Fontaine section of the room because there had been, it emerged a conversation among certain of the wedding guests about my appearance on the day, and certain photographs from the engagement party had apparently circulated with commentary that I had not been made aware of. He said, "We are a welcoming family, and we welcome Bernard Auger in the spirit of Mathieu's journey, but we thought it was important to be honest about where that journey began." He raised his glass. He said, "To honest work and humble origins." The room raised their glasses. Most of them, I think, were uncomfortable. But 500 people at a wedding in the Loire Valley in June do not decline to raise their glasses when the host raises his. I sat completely still. I did not raise my glass. Helen laughed. It was a specific laugh, the laugh of a woman who has been waiting for a punchline and has received it. Camille was at the head table with her hand over her mouth and her eyes bright with the entertainment of the moment. And I watched my son, and I watched the expression on his face move through surprise and confusion and recognition, and then something that looked very much like the expression he had worn at 9 years old when he finally understood that his mother was not coming home. He stood up. He did not wait for the laughter to die. He pushed back his chair, the sound loud and sharp in the high-ceilinged room, and he stood, and the standing of him silenced the laughter faster than any intervention I could have made. Mathieu is 6'1", and he had his mother's quality of complete presence. And when he was fully present in a room, you felt it. He looked at Gerard, who had returned to the head table but had not yet sat down. He said, "Monsieur Fontaine, I would like to respond to that toast." The politeness of the phrasing was the most dangerous element of it. Gerard, reading it as deference, sat down and gestured magnanimously. "By all means," he said, "all." Mathieu walked to the center of the room. He did not take a microphone. His voice was large enough for the room without one. He looked at the assembled guests, and he said quietly and without performance, "The man at table 19 is my father. His name is Bernard Auger. When I was 6 years old, he came home from a construction site at 9 o'clock in the evening and sat at the kitchen table and helped me with my mathematics homework for 2 hours. and then went back to the site at midnight because there was a concrete pour scheduled for 4 in the morning. He said, "My mother died when I was 9 years old, and my father raised me alone from that day, and he did not once in the following years ask me to be grateful for this or to acknowledge the difficulty of it." He simply continued. He said, "I am an architect. I understand structures. The structure of a person is built from what they do when no one is acknowledging it." He looked at Gerard. He said, "My father's structure is the most sound structure I have ever assessed." He paused. He turned to Camille. I watched her face while he turned to her, and what I saw on her face was not the expression of a woman moved by her husband's defense of his father. It was the expression of a woman recalculating something. He said, "Camille, I love you. I have loved you for 2 years, and I intend to love you for the rest of my life. But I need you to tell me in front of these people that you did not know your father was going to do this." Camille looked at him. The room was entirely silent. Her mother had gone still in the specific way of a person whose plan has developed an unexpected variable. 500 people waited. Camille said, "Matthew, this is not the moment." He said, "I know. That is why I'm asking now." She said, "My father was simply being honest about the differences in our backgrounds. It was a toast. You are being oversensitive." Matthew looked at her for a long moment. "I know my son. I know the specific quality of the silence he goes into when he is processing something that has resolved itself with a clarity he did not want." He nodded very slowly once. Then he said to the room and to no one, "I owe everyone here an apology. I need some time to think." He walked to the side door of the reception hall, the staff door, the door behind the kitchen, and he went through it, and the door closed behind him. The room erupted. Not in the way rooms erupt in films with screaming and drama, in the way rooms erupt when 500 people simultaneously attempt to process something unexpected and significant and begin to do so through 100 simultaneous private conversations. The sound was a roar of whispers. Camille had stood up. Gerard was speaking to her rapidly and quietly. Hélène had her hand on Camille's arm. I looked at all of this from table 19, and then I stood up, put my napkin on the table beside the small lily arrangement, and walked to the staff door. Matthew was in the corridor behind the kitchen. He was sitting on a low step near the service entrance with his morning coat jacket off and his forearms on his knees looking at the floor. He looked up when I came through the door. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has understood something he cannot unfind. I sat down on the step beside him. The corridor smelled of catering food and cold stone. The particular smell of the working areas of a grand building, the smell behind the performance. He said, "Did you know?" I said that he was going to make the speech no. That something of this nature was likely, yes. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you were in love and you were going to marry her, and the evidence I had was circumstantial, and I did not want to be the person who made you choose between your father's assessment and your own happiness before you had gathered your own evidence." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She knew. She knew he was going to do it." I said, "I don't know that." He said, "I do." I said, "Matthew, what do you want to do?" He looked at the floor for a while. Then he said, "I want to go back in there and speak to Camille alone." I said, "Good." He said, "And after that, I want to go home." I looked at him. He looked back at me. We were sitting in a service corridor behind a 16th century chateau in the Loire Valley, and my son had just potentially ended his wedding, and I looked at his face, and what I saw on it was not devastation. It was the expression I had seen at 9 years old after the worst thing. When he had come downstairs on the third morning and sat at the kitchen table and asked me what we were having for breakfast in a voice that was not pretending. The worst thing had not happened, but that had decided to continue anyway. It was the expression of a person who has identified a structural problem and is beginning the assessment. I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I had when he was small. He leaned his head against mine for a moment. Then he stood up, picked up his jacket, and went back through the door. What happened in the following hour I know from Matthew's account given to me 3 days later in my office in Paris. He asked to speak to Camille privately. They went to a small sitting room off the main corridor. He asked her directly whether she had known about the speech. She told him that her father had mentioned he intended to acknowledge the difference in their backgrounds and that she had not anticipated the specific form it took. He asked her whether she found it funny. She said she thought his reaction was disproportionate. He asked her whether she would have objected if her father had made that speech at table 19 with her knowledge and her consent. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Mathieu, this is the world we are living in now. People have to understand where they come from. He said, I know exactly where I come from. He took off the wedding ring. He put it on the table between them. He said, I want you to tell your father that I wish him well. He stood up and walked out. The wedding ended at that point in the sense that the wedding stopped being a wedding. It continued in the sense that 500 people were in a 16th century chateau with 3 courses still remaining and a dessert station and an open bar. And these things proceeded because no one had officially canceled them and because the Fontaine family, in the shock of the initial development, had not yet reached the stage of practical management. Gerard Fontaine attempted, I was told, to address the room. I did not hear this because I was in the car park with Mathieu standing beside my Peugeot while he called a car to take him to the nearest station. Before the car arrived, I told him what I needed to tell him. I told him about Auger Development in its full dimensions. I told him about the holding structure and the portfolio and the number at the bottom of the last annual valuation that Paul Krieger had given me 3 months earlier. I told him all of it in the particular unadorned way I tell things that are factual and important. He sat on the bonnet of my Peugeot and he listened. He did not say anything for a long time after I finished. Then he said, how long? I said, always. He said, why didn't you tell me? I said, because I wanted you to know the world as it is when you do not have the armor of wealth. I wanted you to learn to read people correctly. He said, I did not read Camille correctly. I said, no. But you corrected the error as soon as you had sufficient evidence. That is not a failure of reading. That is how reading works. He looked at me with his mother's eyes, which are his eyes, which are the specific dark brown of good coffee in morning light. He said, what happens now with the Fontaines? I said, nothing dramatic, nothing immediate. I said, Paul has been preparing some documentation for the past 6 months. I said, Gerard Fontaine has 3 ongoing construction projects in Lyon and 1 in Marseille, and all of which are co-financed through a consortium that includes investment vehicles I control through the holding structure. I said, the consortium has the right to withdraw from any of the co-financing arrangements on the provision of 30 days notice. I said, Isabel is filing that notice on Monday. Mathieu looked at me. He said, you prepared all of this before the wedding. I said, I prepared the capacity for a response. I did not know what form the response would need to take. Now I know. He said, is it legal? I said, entirely. The consortium has contractual rights. We are exercising them. He said, is it right? I considered this. I said, Gerard Fontaine stood in a room of 500 people and pointed at your father and used him as a demonstration of what you should be ashamed of. He did this as a performance in front of journalists and business contacts and several of the most significant clients your practice has in Lyon. He did this knowing you would be present. He did this because he believed the consequences for him would be nothing. I said, I am providing consequences. I believe providing accurate consequences for actions is one of the more useful things a person can do in the world. Mathieu looked at me for a long time. Then he said, Papa. He said, I am sorry. He said, I did not protect you. I said, Mathieu, I do not need protecting. I said, I needed you to see clearly. I said, you see clearly now. His car arrived. He got in. He rolled down the window. He said, Monday is fine. I said, I know. He said, come for dinner on Tuesday. I said, I will come for dinner on Tuesday. He left. I stood in the car park of the Chateau de Montsoreau, and the evening was coming on, and the Loire Valley was doing what the Loire Valley does in June evenings, which is to become one of the most beautiful landscapes in the world, with the specific, unhurried inevitability of a place that has been beautiful for a very long time and expects to continue. I stood there for a few minutes. Then I got in my Peugeot and drove back to Paris. On Monday morning, Isabel filed the notice of withdrawal from the three Lyon co-financing arrangements and the Marseille project. The total value of the financing being withdrawn was 47 million euros across four developments at various stages of construction. The 30-day notice period was contractually clean, unambiguous, and entirely unsurprising to anyone who had read the original agreements carefully, which Gerard Fontaine's lawyers apparently had not. I also called Henri Laroche on Monday morning. I told him the story was now. I told him the name Ceylon Capital and the name Vallon Investissements and the connection to Gerard Fontaine's portfolio, and I told him nothing that was not already in the public record of business registrations and the contractual documentation that was about to be served. I said, the story is not about me. The story is about co-financing vulnerability in the Lyon commercial property sector and the risks of over-leveraged development structures when consortium financing is not diversified. He said, and you happen to be in a position to illustrate this story with a live example. I said, I happen to be. He said, is there anything you want to keep out? I said, my name for now, use the company names. Use. I am a source, not a subject. He said, understood. He published a piece on Thursday that was thorough, accurate, and which named Gerard Fontaine's projects as the illustrative examples without naming the entity exercising the withdrawal. The piece was read by everyone who needed to read it in the Lyon business community, and it was the first destabilizing tremor in the ground beneath the Fontaine family's reputation for sound business management. I know what happened in the Fontaine household in the days following because Mathieu heard some of it from Camille, who was attempting over the following weeks to manage a situation she had not anticipated, and that was deteriorating faster than her management capacity could handle. Gerard received the notice on Tuesday morning. He called the consortium directly and was connected to a junior administrator who confirmed the filing. He called his lawyer. His lawyer reviewed the agreements and called back within 2 hours to confirm that the withdrawal was legally sound. Gerard then called every contact he had in the Lyon business community who might have a connection to the unnamed parties behind the consortium. A process that took 3 days and produced nothing useful because the holding structure through which I operated was not named Augur anything. It was not named after me at all. It was called Ceylon Capital, which is a French word for the furrow a plow makes in a field, and I had named it that because I liked the image of it, the invisible line that determines where things grow. On the Friday of that week, Gerard Fontaine found out who owned Ceylon Capital. I do not know exactly how. Paul thought it was probably through a financial journalist who ran a piece that week about unusual movement in the Lyon commercial property co-financing sector, a piece that named Ceylon Capital and then noted in a single line near the end that Ceylon Capital was a subsidiary of the Augur Group, whose principal was Bernard Augur, the founder of Augur Développement, one of the largest privately held construction and development groups in France, with assets under management estimated at approximately 800 million euros. The journalist had done their research. The 800 million figure was conservative but not inaccurate. I was told that Gerard Fontaine sat in his office in Lyon for approximately 30 minutes after reading this piece, not making any calls and not speaking to anyone, and then he called Hélène. What they said to each other, I do not know. What I know is that on the Saturday morning, 8 days after the wedding, Gerard Fontaine called Isabel's office and asked to arrange a meeting with me at my earliest convenience. I told Isabel to let him know that my calendar was full for the foreseeable future. He tried again the following week through a mutual business contact. I told the contact politely that I had nothing to discuss with Gerard Fontaine. He wrote a letter. It arrived at my office by courier. It was 3 pages long and it contained an apology, a characterization of the wedding speech as a misunderstanding that had been poorly framed, and an expression of hope that the business matters might be resolved without further disruption to the ongoing projects and the workers employed on them. He mentioned the workers specifically. He mentioned them twice. It was the correct thing to mention, and it was mentioned cynically, and I recognized both of these things simultaneously. I wrote a response. It was 1 paragraph. It said that I accepted his acknowledgement that the speech had been poorly framed and that I wished him well personally. It said that the withdrawal from the co-financing arrangements was a business decision made on commercial grounds and was not connected to personal matters. This was not entirely true, but it was legally true, and it closed the door on any claim that the withdrawal was retaliatory, which it was, though, in a form that was entirely legal and entirely proportionate. The four projects proceeded after the withdrawal with difficulty. Two of the Lion projects found replacement financing from other sources at worse terms after a delay of 11 weeks. One Lion project was suspended for 6 months while Girard attempted to restructure the financing and ultimately had to bring in a new equity partner who acquired a 30% stake in the development at a valuation that significantly reduced Girard's return on the original investment. The Marseille project was sold at a loss to a competitor. Not a catastrophic loss, but a real one. Real enough to be noticed by the people who noticed Girard's affairs. Real enough to shift the gradient of his reputation in the Lyon business community from the solid upward incline it had maintained for years to something more uncertain. These were not things I engineered beyond the withdrawal itself. They were consequences of the withdrawal operating in the natural environment of a business that had been structured with insufficient margin for the kind of disruption that legitimate contractual exercise can produce. A well-structured business absorbs this kind of event. A business built on the assumption that certain relationships are permanent and certain financing is unconditional is more vulnerable to it. Girard had built the second kind of business. Mathieu and Camille's legal separation was filed in September. Camille had retained a lawyer who was good at his job and who negotiated firmly and correctly on her behalf. Mathieu had retained an equally good lawyer. The process was conducted without drama, which surprised me slightly given the dramaturgy of the wedding. I think the absence of drama was partly Matthew's temperament and partly Camille's recognition, once the calculations had been completed, that an amicable settlement was in her interest. The settlement was fair. Mathieu was generous. He was the kind of man who is generous in separations because he cannot be otherwise, because generosity for him is structural rather than situational. He was not destroyed by any of it. This is the part I want to be clear about because it is the most important part. He spent 2 months after the wedding in the specific focused state he goes into when he is working through something difficult, quieter than usual present at dinners, but slightly absent, running more than he normally ran. In October, he came to my office and we ate sandwiches at my desk. And he told me he had been offered a significant public commission in Bordeaux, a cultural center on the riverfront, and that he was going to take it and spend the next 2 years in Bordeaux working on it. I said that sounded right. He said, I think it is exactly right. He looked at me across the desk with his mother's eyes. He said, I have been thinking about something you said in the car park. He said, about wanting me to learn to read people correctly. I said, yes. He said, I want to ask you something. I said, ask. He said, do you think the way to read people correctly is to see them when they think no one is watching? I thought about this. I said, yes, that is exactly right. He nodded. He ate his sandwich. He said, that is what I was doing in the car park of that chateau. I was watching how they watched you when you sat down at that table. I said, and what did you read? He said, everything I needed. He went to Bordeaux in November. He called twice a week, which was more than he had called when he was in Lyon. And I understood this as a recalibration of distance and closeness, and I received it as it was intended. The Cultural Center project was everything he described, complex and ambitious, and the kind of work that required the full application of everything he knew and had learned. When he threw himself into it with the specific commitment that I recognized from my own early years, the commitment of someone who has stripped away a distraction and can now move at full speed toward the thing that actually matters. He sent me photographs of the site in December, the Riverside plot in winter, the ground still open, the foundation work in its early stages. He sent notes about the structural challenges, about the way the Garonne's particular soil conditions required modifications to the standard pile design, about a decision he had made regarding the orientation of the main facade that had involved a compromise with the engineering team that he was not entirely satisfied with and was still thinking about. The notes had the quality of his thinking when it was fully engaged, precise, and honest about uncertainty. The thinking of someone who cares more about getting it right than about being seen to get it right. I wrote back. We had always corresponded this way in notes that were not quite letters, but not quite messages, either, a format that suited us both. I sent him a photograph of a bridge rehabilitation project I had been asked to advise on in northern France. A 19th century railway viaduct in the Somme that needed a complete assessment of its masonry condition before a proposed light rail restoration. I told him about the specific fascination of old masonry. The way a skilled stonemason's work from 150 years ago still carries information in its joints and courses about the loading conditions it was built to manage and the adjustments made when those conditions turned out to be different from the calculations. He wrote back about how that related to a problem he was having with the cultural center's roof structure, and we went back and forth on it for 3 weeks, and it was one of the best conversations I had that year. In March, he called me on a Thursday evening. He said he had met someone. He said her name was Leah. He said she was a structural engineer from Nantes who was working on the cultural center project and who had found an error in his load calculations during a site review and had come to him directly to discuss it rather than putting it through formal channels. He said, she was right about the calculations, and she was direct about being right, and she did not make it about anything other than the structure needing to be correct. He said, I found that interesting. I said, I imagine you did. I asked him to tell me about her. He told me she had studied at the École Centrale in Nantes and had worked on 3 major bridge projects and a coastal flood defense installation in Brittany, and that she had a reputation in her firm for finding the problem in the design that everyone else had looked at and missed. He said she cooked badly and read constantly and ran every morning before the site opened and had an opinion about every piece of architecture she had ever seen and did not keep the opinion to herself. He said she had asked him on their second meeting what his father did, and he had said construction, and she had said what kind of construction, and he had said large scale, and she had said how large, and he had said quite large, and she had looked at him and said, Mathieu, I will find out eventually. You might as well tell me now. He had told her. She had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, that is interesting. Does it affect your work? He had said no. She had said, good. Then it doesn't matter. He said, that was it. She just moved on. I said, yes, that sounds right. He said, she has never heard of the Auger Group. I said, good. He said, I told her my father was in construction. I said, that is accurate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Papa. I said, yes. He said, I am going to do this correctly this time. I said, I know you are. He said, how do you know? I said, because you know what incorrectly looks like now. He said, yes. He said, I do. He told me 3 months later that he had asked Leah whether she wanted to visit Paris. She had said yes. She arrived on a Friday afternoon in June, and Mathieu brought her to my office that evening, and I shook her hand, and she shook mine. And she looked at my hand for a moment, as people do when they meet someone for the first time, and then she looked at me directly and said, Mathieu says you built your company from one project. I said, that is correct. She said, what was the first project? I told her. She said, that is a good place to start. Not glamorous, but load-bearing. I said, exactly right. Mathieu was standing slightly behind her, and I could see his expression. And his expression was the expression of a man who has just watched 2 people he trusts confirm each other's quality. She stayed for dinner. She ate everything on the table and had opinions about the building we were in, and asked Paul Krieger about the tax treatment of historic structure renovation, and disagreed with one of his answers and was right about it. She left at 11 o'clock, and Mathieu and I washed up the dishes, and he said, well, I said, well, what? He said, what do you think? I said, I think she found the error in your calculations. He said, yes. I said, anyone who finds the error in your calculations has my complete confidence. He laughed. It was the laugh I had been waiting for since the Loire Valley, the specific laugh of a man who is genuinely and unguardedly happy. I am sitting in my office as I write this in the building on the 8th arrondissement, with the view of the Seine. The river is doing what it always does. Paul Krieger sent me the quarterly report this morning, and the numbers are what they are, which is to say, substantial and well managed and in the care of people I trust. Isabel has 3 matters ongoing that are unremarkable and professionally handled. Matthew called yesterday and told me the Cultural Center Foundation has passed inspection and that Leia's calculations were correct and that they are planning to spend Easter in Nantes with her family. He sounded on the phone the way he had sounded before the Fontaine period, like himself, which is to say, like his mother's attentiveness and my stubbornness, arranged in a configuration that is better than either one alone. I drove past a construction site this morning on my way in from the 8th, a residential development in the 15th large scale, probably 300 units. I stopped at the light adjacent to the site entrance, and I watched the site for the length of the red light. I watched the traffic of materials and equipment and workers in the early morning. The organized, purposeful noise of a large project in its construction phase. I watched the site foreman standing near the gate with a set of drawings under his arm, talking to a delivery driver pointing to a section of the site, the drawings speaking for themselves. The light changed, and I drove on. I thought about being 22 years old on a site in the eastern suburbs with no vocabulary for the things I could see and every determination to find the vocabulary. People sometimes ask me why I have not retired. I am 68 years old, and the company generates income I will not live to spend, and there is no practical argument for my continued involvement. I tell them what is true, which is that I am not working for the income. I am working because the work is the thing. It has always been the thing. The money was the evidence that the work was being done correctly, the numerical expression of structural soundness, but it was never the point of the structure. The structure was the point of the structure. You build things because you understand how they work, and because the world needs things built correctly, and because the feeling of looking at something you have built and knowing it is sound is a feeling that nothing else produces and that does not diminish with repetition. I built a company for 40 years. I raised a son alone for 25. I sat at a small table at a wedding in June, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not perform my dignity, and I did not explain myself to a man who was not worth the explanation. Then I went home and made 3 phone calls and waited for the structure to do what correctly built structures do. The Fontaines. Gerard continues in business with the adjustments that the past 9 months have required. He is by all accounts a somewhat more careful man than he was. Helene runs her foundation. Camille, from what Mathieu hears occasionally through mutual connections, has taken a position with a cultural organization in Paris and is by available accounts fine. I genuinely wish her fine. She was not a villain. She was a person who had been taught that certain values were correct and who had not yet encountered sufficient evidence to revise those values. She encountered that evidence at a wedding in the Loire Valley, and the evidence cost her something real. I hope the cost was instructive. I think it probably was. The wedding photographer published a selection of photographs from the event in an industry portfolio 6 months later. There is one photograph I have seen that someone sent to me without comment, a photograph taken during Gerard Fontaine's second speech. It shows the reception hall from above, taken from a gallery level, a wide shot of all the tables. In the center of the frame is the head table, elaborate and lit by the chateau's chandeliers. At the far left of the frame, at the edge, small but clear, is table 19. At table 19, there is a man in a not very good suit with a glass of water in front of him and a small lily arrangement. He is sitting very straight. He is looking at the man who has come to stand over him, and he is looking at him with an expression that the photographer has caught with the precision of a lens that does not know what it is recording. The expression is completely calm. It is the expression of a man who has been here before, in rooms where someone believed they had the power to define him, and who has learned. Over 68 years of building things that the definition of a man is in what he builds and not in what others say about him when they think the walls are permanent. The walls were not permanent. They never are. The foundation, if it is correctly laid, outlasts every wall built on top of it. My name is Bernard Auger. I am 68 years old. I drove to the Loire Valley in a 7-year-old Peugeot and sat at table 19 and watched a man try to use me to diminish my son. Then I went home and made 3 phone calls. Then I waited for the structure to do what correctly built structures do, which is to make the truth visible. It took time. It always takes time. Always takes. But time is on the side of the foundation, not the decoration. It has always been on the side of the foundation. I know this because I have been building things for 42 years, and every building I have ever been responsible for has taught me the same lesson from a different angle. The lesson is this: the part of the structure that receives the most attention during construction is almost never the part that determines whether the structure stands or falls. The part that determines whether the structure stands or falls is always below the ground in the dark, where no one is looking, where no one will look for 100 years unless something goes wrong. The foundation is the building's character. The building is just the foundation made visible over time. Gerard Fontaine believed he was building a position of social strength. He was decorating a surface that had no foundation beneath it. The financing vulnerability was there before I withdrew from it. The reputation was built on the assumption of permanence that all insufficiently founded things assume. The assumption was wrong. It was always wrong. The withdrawal simply made the wrongness visible on a specific Monday morning rather than on some future morning when a different creditor made a different decision, for reasons that had nothing to do with a wedding speech in June. I am sitting here with my coffee, which is a good coffee from a machine I bought because it makes a good coffee and for no other reason, and I am looking at the sand, and I am thinking about table 19. The small lily arrangement, the slightly too white tablecloth, the steam from the kitchen door, 500 people turning in their chairs to look at the man in the not very good suit. I would go back and sit at that table again tomorrow. I would sit there every day for a year if it meant Mathieu had what he has, now a clear eye, a good project, a woman who found the error in his calculations and told him directly. I would sit at every small table in every expensive room in France if that was the price. It was not much of a price. It was an afternoon. That is the only luxury that matters. I looked at the river and I drank my coffee, and the foundation held. It always held. That is what foundations do. That is what